Final quote from David. People ask me how I keep going, how I stay cheerful, why I don't quit. That is pretty easy and I don't dodge it. I work for peace because we sometimes win and sometimes lose, but have a responsibility to try. Because trying is far more enjoyable and fulfilling than anything else. Please welcome David Swanson.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for those wonderful remarks. You should all become, as I have, an associate member of Veterans for Peace. You just have to be for peace. You don't have to be a veteran. I want to thank also Sally Alice Thompson, who brought me here, I believe, principally, and is sitting in the front row here. Can we have some applause for Sally Alice? There is something happening right now as we speak in the United States Senate, and I'll talk in a little more detail shortly about what it means. But if they vote yes on a measure against the war on Yemen, and you happen to know that from your phone or some other technology I don't even understand, please interrupt me and shout that out. And if they vote the wrong way, I'd like to know that too. So there is a big loophole in the bill, and there is the matter still of selling Saudi Arabia its weapons, and there is the House of Representatives to worry about, and there is the veto threat. And there is the question of getting compliance out of a president you've pretty well promised never to impeach, at least not for any of dozens of documented offenses unrelated to Russia. All that being said, the current action is a very, very good thing. And New Mexico's senators have thus far been on the right side of it. If the U.S. Congress were to stand up to a president on one war, people might raise the question of every other war. If the U.S. were to stand up to Saudi Arabia, not by giving it weapons and military assistance and protection from international law while asking it gently to mend its ways, but by refusing to be its partner in crime, somebody might ask why the same couldn't be tried with Israel or Bahrain or Egypt and so on. But you can't just end a war, can you? What should we replace the war on Yemen with? This is a question people actually ask me. When this war was what President Obama called a, quote, successful drone war, the question was usually something like this: hey, would you rather have a real war? At least with a drone war, nobody gets killed. Now, without commenting on who counts as nobody and who doesn't, I will just recall that I would respond that I'd replace it with nothing whatsoever, but that it would eventually replace itself with a worse war, as it has since done. Wars are different from other things one might propose to end. If I say we should get rid of mass incarceration or gerrymandering or fossil fuel subsidies or livestock or nations or religions or war monuments or major television networks or corporate tax breaks or the United States Senate or the Central Intelligence Agency or the offsides rule or the acceptability of revenge or private campaign funding or aircraft carriers or telemarketing or the Electoral College or the Commission on Presidential Debates or advertising on stadiums. Sorry, sometimes it's hard to stop. It may or may not make sense, depending on one's perspective, to ask what I would replace each of those things with. You might be asking, in the absence of gerrymandering, exactly how would districts be drawn? But in the absence of advertising on stadiums, the answer could be stadiums with taxes on corporations, or it could just be stadiums without advertising on them. Not everything needs a replacement, does it? If I say we should get rid of murder or theft or child abuse or rape or the torture of kittens, there are a lot of people who would not ask, but what would you replace it with? There are even people to whom I could say that we should end the torture of human beings, not just kittens, who would still not respond by saying, well, what would you replace it with? Now let's look at the war on Yemen. It's killing men, women, children by the tens or hundreds of thousands and risking the death of millions more. It's putting men, women, and children through the agony of deadly diseases, starvation, violent attack, and the ever-present possibility of instant death or maiming. Compared to what this war is doing to millions of people who now live with their families in the middle of what used to be called a battlefield, compared to that, being threatened with a bunch of roving Muslims from Honduras crossing the border and taking over your job almost sounds like good news. I mean, at least on your way out the door, you'd get to learn something about Hondurans and why they're all Muslims, and maybe even get your hands on that priceless answer to the eternal question, why do they hate us? And for what you could sell that answer to Fox News for, you wouldn't need your job anymore. The war on Yemen is making a few stinking rich people even richer, but most people poorer. It's causing horrendous damage to the natural environment, including the Earth's climate, and to a society's basic infrastructure. It's making the United States hated, and people who live here less safe, not more safe. It's strengthening Al-Qaeda and ISIS and violence in general. It's distracting from actual problems that need to be solved rather than manufactured, such as climate, such as nuclear danger, such as oligarchy. It's serving as an excuse to flood that region with yet more weapons and to keep propping up the nation with the very worst human rights record on earth. A human rights record, by the way, consists of how you treat humans outside of wars. You could bomb 1 billion houses but never kill anybody with a scimitar or a bone saw and have a glowing human rights record. Or you could oversee a death camp but wage no wars and you would have a miserable human rights record. Or you could wage more wars than anybody else and lock up more prisoners than anybody else and engage in executions and solitary confinements and racist police killings and allow the most poverty and suffering among all wealthy nations and still have such an awesome human rights record that your people will believe your wars are waged for the purpose of spreading human rights. Anyway, my point is that you should, of course, only give bombs to governments that have good human rights records because pretty much everybody prefers to be bombed by those governments. The war on Yemen is accomplishing nothing good, while the harm it is doing could be listed for the next hour. And it's costing financially many times what it would take to transform that nation for the better through actual aid. So what should we replace the war with? What should we do instead of bombing Yemen? Not bomb Yemen. Generally, that is my first answer when it comes to any war, although there are two other good answers, I think, progressively less flippant. And I think they're needed, because even though wars like the war on Yemen are fought by militaries, like the US and Saudi militaries, if I ask, what should we replace the US military with? Nobody thinks that's a crazy question in the way that I do. That is, nobody thinks it's as ridiculous a question as, what should we replace kitten torturing with? If anything, people think it's a crazy question because they aren't ready to think that militaries should be abolished. The second type of answer one can give to what would you do instead of the war on, insert the name of a nation almost nobody can find on a map, is that you should address the supposed problem by sensible means, rather than killing large numbers of people and attempting to somehow connect that to the advertised problem. In other words, search for the non-existent weapons, or prosecute the alleged crime in an actual court, or negotiate an agreement prior to a massacre that you're pretending has been threatened, or bring home the US citizens you are claiming are in danger, or as many of them as you can convince to leave. Usually you'll be dealing with a pile of lies, but I think the solution works either way. Libya wasn't at risk of mass slaughter, but bombing it created that. Iraq wasn't overrun with terrorists, but now it is. Wouldn't allowing the African Union to meet with Gaddafi or allowing the inspectors to keep searching for the weapons in Iraq have been better than actually making real the fictional concern? Afghanistan was willing to let bin Laden be put on trial. Why not do that? Vietnam was not actually attacking the United States by not actually firing back at ships off its coast. Why not show the Vietnamese the absence of any damage to the ships and ask them to pay the $0 for the needed repairs? Spain was willing to go to arbitration over the ship it did not blow up in Havana Harbor. Why not do that? This answer looks a little different when a just cause has been attached to a past war. Whatever you may think of slaughtering 750,000 young men and then ending slavery, most of the world rid itself of slavery or serfdom without that first step. If we were to decide to end mass incarceration, would we first find some fields and kill each other in large numbers and then end mass incarceration? I tend to think we'd be much better off to just jump straight to ending mass incarceration, gradually or rapidly, but without the mass murder first. When I talk about war lies and about the fact that a just cause can be glued onto a war but cannot become an inherent part of it, cannot actually justify it, people will sometimes ask, well, but then what is the real reason for all the wars? If the glorious sacrament of Pearl Harbor was not actually a surprise, but was sought out, if the United States didn't actually fight to save Jews, but refused them and condemned them to their fate, if Iraq didn't really take babies out of incubators, if Mexico didn't really shoot first, if the commies didn't really have a set of super dominoes ready to take over the globe, if Saddam Hussein's friendship with Al-Qaeda was about as strong as Donald Trump's sense of humility, if Canadians aren't all miserable servants of the King of England as a result of never having yet fought a bloody revolution, if the native peoples of this continent aren't actually better off for having been slaughtered, then why? Why do it? You can't just run around killing people by the tens of millions and risking nuclear apocalypse without some reason. What's the reason? I hate to break it to most of the people who email me the answer to this question on a regular basis, but the answer is not, as far as I can tell, any one single thing, or necessarily rational at all. Is it financial corruption? Yes, that's part of it, but not the biggest part, at least not simply and directly through buying elected officials. There's also the buying of media, the funding of think tanks, the funding of political parties that buy officials, the screening out of any candidates who might push peaceful proposals on their colleagues, etc. But that's still not much of the answer. The answer is also not the existence of a secret subspecies of sociopaths who look just like you and me but have no souls, a contention that is no more established by science than are the racist theories of the surging fascists. It's also not public opinion, democracy in action, at least not simply and completely. If we had direct democracy, few if any wars would get started, and military spending would be slashed, likely stimulating a reverse arms race that would eventually make any speeches like this one superfluous. Trump took the White House after making as many anti-war as pro-war statements. Clinton lost a couple of key states to, among many other fair and unfair factors, the belief among military families that she would be more likely to get their loved ones killed. The last time people gave the Democrats the majority in Congress, it was explicitly to end the war on Iraq, which the Democrats then escalated. Luckily, they haven't been given the majority for any especially clear purpose this time. Nor can we attribute all the wars to simple inertia, though it is a major factor. You set up an empire of bases, you sell and give weaponry to the most volatile areas, you arm and train 3/4 of the world's dictators by your own definition of dictator, you train and practice for every possible and plenty of impossible wars, you normalize war to the point that nobody even notices them. Few can even name all current U.S. wars. Nobody can name all current U.S. bases or even the countries they are in. CNN asks a presidential candidate if they'd be willing to kill hundreds and thousands of children. Starbucks says it has a store at Guantanamo because not to have one there would amount to taking a political position. You manipulate language and policy until it's easier to add more wars than to end any of them. Yet still, inertia is not enough. Somebody has to act. I've never seen a war that didn't have a lot of real motivations, all of them misguided or reprehensible, and usually chief among them the crazed desire to dominate the earth and to inflict pain and suffering. And a lot of pretended motivations, all of them false or ludicrous. One of the real motivations that has always been around, but which has taken a different twist and emphasis lately, is related to image. If you've been to a lot of peace rallies, you may be familiar with the person who may or may not be secretly working for the police, who believes that a good, energized, nonviolent rally that's being ignored by the corporate media would be better off boosted onto the front page by smashing a few windows, even if that action actually ensures that the next rally will be smaller rather than larger. Now imagine finding that guy and making him president of the United States. Imagine the people running the big television networks making him president of the United States because they completely agree with him that there is no such thing as bad attention. The CEO of CBS, in explaining all the free airtime for one candidate, said that Donald Trump might be bad for the United States, but he sure was good for ratings. As president, Trump seems to be driven by, in no particular order, what Fox News says, what gets him the most attention, what the last person in the room with him said, what increases his personal financial profits, and what results in the most minutes of Trump on TV. But Trump is not alone in caring, in his own way, what certain media outlets say about him. According to the Pentagon Papers, 70% of the reason for continuing the war on Vietnam for many years and millions of deaths was simply so as not to end it, because ending it would be criticized more than any method of continuing it. Or so the war planners believed, and it wasn't a crazy expectation. Watch what the so-called liberal media says every time Trump takes a step away from or a step toward nuclear war with Russia or North Korea. Media outlets' loyalties are not to peace or justice, but to the storylines they've developed. The most recent commander of the U.S.-led war on Afghanistan recommended ending it, as have others, the moment he was out of it. But the reason that recommendation, made about this war by former top officials of all kinds for longer than high school graduates have been alive now, has not been acted on, is probably best summed up by what another commander of that crime, Stanley McChrystal, said recently. McChrystal is played by Brad Pitt in The War Machine on Netflix, but he said this stranger-than-fiction line in reality. He said this when asked what should be done in Afghanistan. Quote, "I met with Secretary Pompeo this morning, and he asked me the same question, and I said, I don't know. I wish I did. If I had a clever answer, if we pull out and people like Al-Qaeda go back, it's unacceptable. For any political administration in the U.S., it would just be disastrous, and it would be a pain for us. If we put more troops in there and we fight forever, that's not a good outcome either. I'm not sure what is the right answer. My best suggestion, to keep a limited number of forces there and just kind of muddle along and see what we can do. But that means you're going to lose some people. And then it's fair for Americans to ask, why am I doing this? Why am I putting my sons and daughters in harm's way? And the answer is there's a certain cost to doing things in the world, being engaged. That's not as satisfying. That's not an applause line kind of answer, but that's what I think, the only thing I could recommend." End quote. The U.S. military is getting a bit desperate for recruits, and still I have yet to see a poster reading, "Sign up to kill people and risk your life for the cause of muddling along." increase your risk of suicide. We can't promise you won't end up freezing on a street or shooting up a nightclub, but we can guarantee we'll start lots more wars in the name of supporting you. There's muddling along, and then there's army muddling along. A muddling of one. Continuing war so as not to end war. That's a recipe for perma-war. And that's what we've got. Wars that cannot be ended. Unless they try to end one tonight. And wars that not enough people demand the ending of, because not enough of the people being killed in the wars count as what Stanley McChrystal considers people. This past year in Afghanistan has been quite deadly, possibly the deadliest, with more bombs dropped than at any time since the peak in 2011, but fewer than 15 of the deaths have been members of the U.S. military. That number goes up if you count suicides and various other categories that are left out, but it remains tiny compared to Afghan deaths and compared to past wars. That's what bombing poor people does. It creates one-sided slaughters. But does the U.S. media tell you about it? I just watched a Hollywood movie called Shock and Awe, which dealt with the wars on Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam, and I had to wait for a line of text on the screen at the end for any indication that anyone from any nation attacked had been harmed in any way. Apart from that, it seemed the U.S. wars must be waged against U.S. troops who do 100% of the suffering in the wars. Across the political spectrum, the grandest remaining acceptable form of bigotry is that which considers 96% of humanity to be virtually worthless in comparison with the other 4%. 2 weeks ago, Senator Elizabeth Warren claimed the war on Iraq had killed 6,000 people. Of course, there are well over 1 million, possibly 2 million people who lived there and who also died, and we have nothing against them, but they aren't, people, wink, wink. Except without the wink winking, because this is right out in the open. Try, I dare you, to find a U.S. newspaper article about that U.S. Civil War that ended slavery that either, one, admits that it didn't end slavery, or two, refrains from referring to it as the deadliest U.S. war ever. You're far more likely to find a skeptical article about the war on Christmas. Y'all are aware, I assume, that the U.S. Civil War is far from the deadliest U.S. war ever. By the way, I understand that Congressman Adam Smith has said he will introduce legislation to cut off funding for the war on Afghanistan. I think we should support ending the war on Yemen and the war on Afghanistan and putting part of the money from both into a Green New Deal. And I think the draft Green New Deal should acknowledge that the military budget exists as a potential source of funds and that militarism does severe environmental damage that needs to be halted. I've not encountered an actual war on Christmas, but it has been a long time since the United States had fewer than a half dozen wars raging on any given Christmas. And almost nobody can even name them. Almost everybody can tell me that some wars are justified and others are not, but almost nobody can tell me which are which, or even name the existing wars in order to discuss them. A problem that I don't think even the ancient Romans had. Apart from Yemen, there is, of course, the war on Afghanistan that we refer to as the longest U.S. war ever, because the wars against the people who lived in North America were not real wars because they were not actually real people. Bombing is up dramatically in Afghanistan last year and again this year, according to the U.S. Air Force Central Command's account of what they call Operation Freedom's Sentinel. Imagine how much worse the prisons would be that the little refugee children are getting stuck in if not for Operation Freedom's Sentinel. They are now going to start making us pay to hold rallies in Washington, D.C., but I'm sure it would be a much higher fee without Operation Freedom's Sentinel. Then there's Operation Inherent Resolve, a war named so well that almost nobody knows where it is. A war that has seen CIA-trained troops and Pentagon-trained troops fighting each other. A war that generally has never made up its mind what it's for, Operation Inherent Resolve, otherwise known as the bombing of both Iraq and Syria. Bombing was up last year when Mosul was demolished, but is down dramatically this year. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism lists documented drone missile strikes. They roll on at a steady pace in Afghanistan and have increased in Yemen and Somalia, but are down drastically in Pakistan. Then there's the ongoing U.S. fighting in Libya. Then there are the wars across North Africa, a number of them fueled by the destruction of Iraq and of Libya. Then there's the endless weapons dealing that has saturated a region of the world that, apart from Israel, makes no more weapons than the Native Americans made whiskey or the Chinese made their own opium. Then there are all the wars threatened and risked, and the smaller scale violence in dozens of nations across the globe. Donald Trump is the first U.S. president since Jimmy Carter not to have yet, and I stress yet, started any big new wars. And the fact that he hasn't, even though his television tells him that he's finally presidential when he bombs people, even though he craves the blind worship that comes to war makers, says something very positive about U.S. culture. While the Vietnam syndrome that Bush the first believed he had cured was never perfect, the Iraq syndrome sure isn't either, but it does exist. It's why Congress said no to a massive bombing of Syria in 2013, and it's undoubtedly a big part of why Trump has not launched an all-out war on Iran. Nobody wants to do something as despised as is what Bush the younger did. Nothing is healthier in U.S. culture than whatever they call a syndrome. Now, I'm not here to deny the existence of the so-called deep state or to tell you that there are no career bureaucrats in Washington, no lobbyists for life, no toxic groupthink, no insidious corruption, but I won't be the first to tell you that Trump is superficial. And I've met a number of Congress members as well. If they weren't superficial to begin with, they become so. And this is not necessarily a bad thing or an anti-democratic thing. If Trump is resistant to attacking Iran because he and others in government know that the rest of us would sooner or later realize that it was a horrendously awful thing to do, and if senators will turn against Saudi Arabia, including senators funded by Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia killed a Washington Post reporter without using a missile, this opens up some possibilities for us. What if we treated wars that kill anyone the way that politicians fear we might treat wars that kill lots of Americans? What if we treated preparations for more wars that way? I haven't even mentioned the main way in which war kills. 3% of U.S. military spending could end starvation on Earth. 1%, the lack of clean drinking water. The United States could provide houses and schools and hospitals for everyone in Afghanistan for far less than it has spent destroying the place. Could things be bad and in some ways worse when the United States gets its military out of Afghanistan? Of course. We've known that and demanded it anyway for many, many years now, based on the understanding that the later it happened, the worse it would be. They say that air pollution both causes the greenhouse effect and reflects sunlight, so that if we actually stopped it and had clean air, the loss of that reflectivity would mean additional warming. But that's no reason whatsoever to continue polluting. Afghanistan has been getting worse in many ways for many years. What if we were to compel the U.S. media to condemn each day of continued occupation that makes things worse the way it is expected to condemn any withdrawal that makes things worse? What if we were to imagine possible ideas to mitigate the damage as if we had at our disposal the unfathomable funds of the U.S. military budget? Could you disarm a country offering $1,000 per gun? Australia did it just offering what guns cost. If you offered people jobs in solar and wind, would they take them? If you can dump hundreds of billions of dollars into cockamamie theories of how to make Afghans like being occupied, why can't you spend less than that on creating a civilian conservation corps for Afghanistan. If armed forces have proven so incapable, but unarmed civilian protectors and nonviolent peace forces have been having successes around the world, why not give the latter a try? The trouble, of course, is that non-war initiatives that cost lots of money are considered expensive, while wars that cost twice as much are considered inevitable. On June 20th, 2013, The Atlantic magazine published an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates called "No, Lincoln Could Not Have Bought the Slaves." Why not? Well, the slave owners didn't want to sell. That's perfectly true. They didn't, not at all. But The Atlantic also focuses on another argument, namely that it would have just been too expensive, costing as much as $3 billion in 1860. Yet, if you read closely, it was easy to miss it. The author admitted that the war cost over twice that much. Nobody foresees what a war will cost at its start. But given that every war in history, as far as I know, has been confidently predicted to cost dramatically less than it ended up costing, and given that wars today don't end, we could start considering their costs to lie in a range somewhere between enormous and infinite. The conglomeration of endless wars on terrorism that have predictably increased terrorism have not, by the way, cost whatever enormous sum the latest report tells you. Each such report on what the wars have cost is actually trying to tell you that only a fraction of military spending is for wars, while the rest of it is for something else unidentified. In fact, military spending is all for wars and preparations for wars. It costs the United States over $1 trillion a year. It's the top destroyer of the natural environment, in addition to being the only place likely to find the funding to seriously mitigate the environmental collapse that may already be locked in, which makes odd the omission of its existence from drafts of the Democrats' version of a Green New Deal and the claim therein that money will simply be manufactured. It is the justification for government secrecy. It is the top justification for the erosion of civil liberties. It is a leading cause of increased racism and bigotry. Its veterans make up over 35% of U.S. mass shooters, but only 14% of the male population of the relevant ages. It has led to people in many countries telling pollsters that the United States is the top threat to peace in the world. The institution of war is counterproductive on its own and anybody else's terms. It does more harm than any particular war. It creates the risk of nuclear apocalypse while many nations are working to ban nuclear weapons. For a particular war to be just, it would have to impossibly be justified on its own terms and just as impossibly outweigh all the death and destruction created and allowed to happen by the choice of dumping our resources into the institution of war. War is the worst and dumbest thing that humans do, and yet it has been so normalized and that it just goes without saying, and the need to be rid of it is never said. If you read the campaign websites of New Mexico's 2 senators and 3 representatives, you will not be able to discover whether any of them thinks 60% of discretionary spending for militarism is too little or too much or just right, nor whether any of them wants the United States to join any of the treaties that it is a holdout on, nor whether any of them wants to end any wars or start any wars, nor whether any of them wants to close any bases or open any bases. On the websites of 2 of them, Ben Ray Lujan and Xochitl Torres Small, you'll find no foreign policy at all, and only be able to infer that the rest of the world must exist because they believe that veterans protect us and defend our freedom, and veterans must do that somewhere. A third, Deb Haaland, provides 3 sentences, count them, 3 sentences, and wants the use of force to be a last resort, but doesn't explain how that's possible. Tom Udall is pleased with the war on Afghanistan, but nonetheless wants it to end some unspecified year or decade. He imagines that the United States is spreading democracy in the Middle East and that giving weapons to Israel is helpful. Martin Heinrich accuses Trump of saber-rattling in one sentence, but of isolationism in the next, sees NATO as a force for good, believes that North Korea and Russia are, quote, worldwide threats, and claims Russia has attacked the United States in some unspecified way. Heinrich says that the United States should only commit the mass murderous crime of starting a war when it has, quote, specific achievable objectives. He adds a couple of sentences supporting foreign aid and addressing climate change. There is a third type of answer to the question, what will you replace this war with? It is to say that we need to replace the whole institution of war with peaceful industries, diplomacy, democratic international institutions, nonviolent conflict resolution, and a culture of peace. This sort of systemic change is outlined in World Beyond War's book, A Global Security System, an Alternative to War. So what do we need to do to get there? We need to demand the immediate end to particular wars and weapons deals, but we need to do so as part of a campaign aimed at total abolition. That means not opposing wars in order to be better prepared for other wars. It means not opposing wars on the grounds that they don't work, and it means not opposing weapons systems on the grounds that they don't work and better working weapons are needed. It means not pretending that the 3 or 4% of the deaths in a war that are U.S. deaths are 100% of the deaths, because they can avoid those deaths while still killing on a massive scale. It means replacing the celebration of militarism in our culture with celebrations of peacemaking. It means educating people to understand and demand steps toward disarmament and conversion. But it does not mean a lack of urgency. The growing calls for immediate and massive nonviolent resistance and strikes and interference, including from groups with appropriate names like Extinction Rebellion, should also be the aim of those who've looked both at the levels of carbon in the atmosphere and at the nuclear doomsday clock. These twin threats are both closer than ever and deeply interlocked. Not only is militarism where the money sits that's needed for environmental protection, but militarism is a major force in the destruction of the environment. I recently wrote a letter to Senator Bernie Sanders asking him to take on militarism in a more serious way. I asked 100 scholars and activists to sign it at first, some of whom are in this room, and many thousands have signed it since. Today, World Beyond War and Roots Action and Code Pink launched a petition to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asking for her Green New Deal to acknowledge the existence of the U.S. military, both as a destructive force and to be scaled back through base closures, and as a source of funding that needs to be moved to human and environmental needs. World Beyond War is working on a couple of particular campaigns. Thank you. A couple of particular campaigns World Beyond War is working on. One is closing bases, and another is divesting from weapons dealers, which can be done at the local level. We are also focused on education. We're speaking in colleges and high schools with groups of teachers, as well as with students. We have free webinars and online courses coming up soon that you can sign up for at worldbeyondwar.org with incredible speakers you can talk with. We're also doing coalition building because war is a top destroyer of the environment and of civil liberties and of the rule of law and a promoter of racism and a hole into which funding is dumped that is needed by every good movement out there. So we can and must build a broader coalition. One opportunity to do that is this coming April 4th, which ought to be a day to mark Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech against war and his assassination exactly 1 year later. But NATO plans to celebrate itself and its wars and its bases and its 70th birthday on April 4th in Washington, D.C. We plan to celebrate peace and to unwelcome NATO to town, and you are invited to come to Washington and to do your own event here. Check out no2nato.org, where you can volunteer, endorse, sponsor, find rides and lodging, etc. In building a larger coalition, there are many things that divide us and distract us. One of the worst things that does both is partisanship. I think it's important to recognize the lessons of history. Most significant change has come primarily from nonviolent movements that have altered what was acceptable, not from putting different people into power. I'm not against elections. I think the United States should have them someday at international levels of fairness and verifiability. I think we should use the rotten system we've got while we've got it. And I'm not opposed to changing who's in power. In fact, I think elections are far too slow and insufficiently punitive, and that we need impeachment and removal and the credible threat of another impeachment and removal, which is far more important than who the person is who steps into the office. And when it comes to elections, if you want to do the lesser evil thing, knock yourself out. Refraining from arguing about that would be an enormous gift of time and energy to our society. But when it's not election day, I consider any and all lesser evil thinking and lesser evil activism to be horribly self-defeating. Years ago, a labor union organized rallies for healthcare legislation and forbid people to say the word single payer, insisting that people pretend to want something called the public option. They had asked the Democrats what people should pretend to want, and of course, in the end, people got neither what they actually wanted nor what they obediently pretended they wanted. Elected officials should do their own compromising. We don't need to do it for them. I recently watched former President Obama bragging about how much he had increased fossil fuel production, bragging about aiding the end of life on this planet. And I recalled that 350.org had held protests of Obama around climate change with Obama logos and cheers for Obama and proclamations that Obama should radically change his ways because they were on his team regardless of whether he did or didn't. A protest demanding the salvation of the earth does not need to be for or against anybody's team. It needs to be for all of humanity. Our identity does not need to be for anybody's team, does not need to be for one corrupt team and against another, or even for the entire 4% of humanity in this country. It needs to be for everybody in this species and in other species, and the ecosystems that we all depend on. Thank you.
So, I presume after those stimulating comments and provocative statements, there may be some questions. And if you've got questions that you've already written down, raise your hand. And if you have questions that you want to write down, raise your hand.
Thank you. So I was kindly provided with 2 questions before I even spoke. I may have touched on them accidentally in my remarks already because they were written before I gave my remarks. But the first one is, in the introduction, I guess the introduction to my speech this evening, you were quoted as saying you sometimes win and sometimes lose. Can you give some examples of where you've won? So somebody, because one of the places I work for, rootsaction.org, does online petitions and email actions, mass emails to Congress members and other targets, I'm often asked don't petitions not work? And so as I replied to that question earlier today, if you go to rootsaction.org and click on About Us and Frequently Asked Questions, there's a long, long list of victories that petitions and email action campaigns just on rootsaction.org have contributed to. And often these have been campaigns, sometimes these have been campaigns that were just an online petition, but usually not. Usually they have been campaigns that involved the in-person delivery and use of that petition, the media use of it, and other nonviolent actions and in-person lobbying and so forth. But there are victories large and small all the time. In my city of Charlottesville, which is now known as the place where Nazis once came and held a rally, we actually have passed through our city council opposition to, I would say, more wars and more military budgets, or at least close to Berkeley. And those are accomplished by collecting names on a petition, talking in the media, holding a couple of events, and bringing a crowd of people that pack a city council meeting. Is not difficult, and it brings people into an organization that can then do further things. Divestment campaigns right now are getting local governments and state governments and universities and other institutions and people's personal investments in investment plans out of weapons dealers, which both tells somebody that victories are possible and organizes and educates people and shames war profiteering, which used to be a shameful thing in this country less than a century ago. I mentioned in 2013 that President Obama wanted a massive bombing campaign of Syria and had promised it to the warmongering senators, some of them no longer with us, in the Senate, and was dead set on it. But that public pressure, which President Obama later admitted, which is the last thing they ever want to admit, public pressure was key to stopping that. And you can go talk to your Congress members and senators and say, if they were there in 2013, and say, what did the calls and emails look like around bombing Syria in 2013? And most of them will tell you it was the most ever on anything, bigger than the bailout of Wall Street, just beyond measure and overwhelmingly, many times against rather than for. And that combined with global pressure and the House of Commons in England opposing a prime minister on a war for the first time since, this place was part, well, not this place, but my part of this country was part of England. So I think that's an example to build on, but it doesn't have the same sort of precedent-setting cachet as passing a resolution to end a war, which is what they're talking about doing right now on Yemen. Just refusing to take up the vote on a war because they aren't going to pass it. It's the exact same victory, but people don't think of it that way. And so, the victory of 1973 of creating the War Powers Resolution, which even though it weakened the actual U.S. Constitution, it laid out specific requirements for starting a war, that victory is being put to use for the very first time in the United States Senate. It has been put to use in the sense of forcing votes on ending wars in the House. Quite a number of times. My friend Dennis Kucinich used to do it regularly. But right now, the so-called leadership of the House is blatantly violating the law, is blatantly violating the War Powers Resolution by refusing to bring the measure to the floor. And we will see if the Senate passes it as a privileged resolution, which is what it is, if the House can continue to say it's not a privileged resolution. Anyway, there are always victories. The Iran agreement, temporarily anyway, was a victory. Each time, I would say, in fact, that the warmongers in Washington have demanded an urgent need to attack Iran, and Iran has not been attacked, and the urgent need has gone away. It's not only been an unmarked victory, that we never get a holiday to celebrate the times we didn't have a war, but it's also helped our argument, because we can now say, oh yeah, what about the last 8 times you said we'd all die if we didn't attack Iran? So, you know, these are things to be remembered and to be built on. Even getting the United Nations to oppose the attack on Iraq in 2003, even though the attack happened, is not a meaningless victory. It made it illegal. It showed potential of what could be done, and it resulted in various nations of the world refusing to go along with other wars. So I had 2 questions here. The second one was, our president has pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal and is pulling the U.S. out of a nuclear treaty with Russia. What do you think of these moves? Bad moves. The Roots Action has organized a whole bunch of groups that has a big petition that's right at the top of rootsaction.org, demanding that Congress take steps to uphold this missile treaty, the intermediate range nuclear treaty with Russia, which in fact Congress has the ability to do. This is why a treaty is better than the Iran agreement, which wasn't a treaty. A treaty has to have Congress involved. Will these actions make the world safer or not? Not. Very clearly not. We lost Yemen vote 2006 to 2003 thanks to 5 Democrats joining Republicans. What to do next? Can anybody confirm that? Is that true? Does anybody know what vote this is referring to? 2005 to 2003, is this a vote this evening in the Senate? Yes, it is. Okay, this may have been a bad idea. There seems to be a lot of confusion, and well, we will find out. What we do next, if they pass this out of the Senate, is very similar to what we do next if they don't. And that is that we demand it come to the floor in the House. We demand it go through the Senate. Again, if it didn't now, we demand that the conference committee put the 2 together and send it to the president. We demand the president sign it. If he vetoes it, we demand it be overridden. If it's overridden, we demand the loophole in it that says it's okay as long as you claim to be fighting Al-Qaeda, which I wouldn't put past them, even though they're actually partnered with Al-Qaeda in the war on Yemen. We demand the closing of that loophole. We demand, in addition, passage of bills that already exist, cutting off the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And we demand passage, at least in January, if not December, of a bill through the House to cut off funding of the war on Afghanistan. And we demand that if that resolution doesn't pass or isn't matched by the Senate, that the House simply declare that it won't fund the war on Afghanistan. Because it only actually takes one chamber, not both of them, to deny funding to something. So we continue, and we educate people, and we bring people in, and we build the coalition along the way, and we make sure that the people in Yemen and the rest of the world know we're doing it. And we ask them what they want us to do. There's a reporter has an article today in These Times magazine on their website that asks 100 people in Yemen what they think of the U.S. war on Yemen, which is very useful in case you run into a senator who says it's actually a pretty good war that's just been, made a few mistakes. Is the text of your speech available anywhere? Not until I get to a computer, and then it will be on davidswanson.org and worldbeyondwar.org and every website I can put it on. Current DOD, I will translate that as Department of War, spending is about $700 billion. what amount might be for actual defense rather than militarism? It's an interesting question. I think it's worth pointing out that there is also a Department of so-called Homeland Security. There is a Department of so-called Energy, most of which is nuclear weapons. There is a Department of State that not only has actual military forces funded through it, including mercenaries, but is largely a marketing firm for U.S. weapons companies. And there is payment on debts from past wars, and there is care for veterans from past wars, and there, any way you slice it, it's over $1 trillion for militarism, just from the United States. And you add in U.S. allies in NATO and not in NATO, and you're talking about 3/4 of world military spending. You know, this notion that the U.S. and NATO have an external threat out there somewhere, when Russia is reducing its military spending, and China's is a fraction of what the U.S. is alone, it's gotten ridiculous, the claims that there's a danger out there. But it is, I think, important that people in this room stop using the word defense to talk about military. Call it military, or explain to me how it's defensive. And with that understanding, you can then go to the Department of War, that's now called the Department of Defense, and say, we would like you to, as a first step anyway, get rid of everything that's not defensive by any argument. That is, you can keep your theories of military defense, you can keep your Coast Guard and your missiles along borders and so forth, but you don't need aircraft carriers in every ocean. You don't need, you know, to be thanking people for watching basketball games in 175 countries. You don't need military forces in 175 countries. You don't need major U.S. bases in 80 countries. You don't need a military presence across the globe that instigates war, that creates war, that does what Eisenhower predicted it would do, that doesn't prevent war or make war less likely. So bring the troops home, close the bases, give them back, get rid of the weaponry that has no defensive purpose, which arguably includes nuclear weaponry, and I think you're talking about 3/4 of the so-called Defense Department, but you wouldn't have to do that on day one. I mean, you could just pass a law that said the U.S. shall not spend any more than 4 times the next nearest nation on militarism. And you would have severe cuts. And then you would see other nations cut. And you would have a reverse arms race that by stages would make people more open to understanding what total abolition would look like. You don't have to go to total abolition today. And in fact, if we had democracy, rather than bombing people for democracy, we would have this. The U.S. public has always said cut military spending. Now, the U.S. public doesn't have a clue what military spending is, but it always says cut it. And when the University of Maryland polling organization sat people down and showed them the U.S. federal budget, that this is militarism, this is schools, and so forth, then the change was even bigger. People wanted to take a huge chunk and move it to education and the environment, and in lesser degrees to other things. So just having direct democracy would do it. Is there one more? Is there a potential Democratic nominee in 2020 who is less pro-military? Less pro-military than what? Well, as I remarked, I think elections are largely an enormous distraction. I think if we don't get imperial powers out of the hands of a single individual, we're doomed, whoever that individual is. I don't know who the nominees are going to be. Obviously, Bernie Sanders is already less militaristic than recent Democratic nominees, would have been less militaristic and might have won in a fair competition in the primaries last time. But I think picking a party you're for before there are any nominees, and then trying to pick a nominee before there are any nominees, and trying to figure out which one is less evil than some other unidentified standard is not the way to go about it. The way to go about it is to make publicly clear and individually clear to the relevant people that you will not support anyone who doesn't meet your standards, and that your standards have to include rapidly scaling back this permanent war on the globe that is counterproductive by its own terms. And when a candidate meets your requirements, then you'll work for that candidate. You know, comes to election day, do the lesser evil vote, I don't care, but don't do it, you know, 2 years out. Wouldn't ending NATO unilaterally increase Russian threats to Europe? No, it would not. Refusing to allow Russia to join NATO, as has been done, might be thought to do that. Refusing to allow Russia to join Europe, which has been done, might do that. Refusing to make friends with Russia in any way might do that. Expanding NATO against promises made eastward right to the border of Russia and installing missiles there, which, if you had to think about Russian missiles on the Mexican and Canadian borders, might do that. I mean, you've made a new Cold War that is far, far more dangerous than the last one, where there was a buffer zone of nations between NATO and Russia. Now there's not. Now there's not. I saw a panel with speakers on a stage like this, where one of them was Vladimir Putin, one of them was the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, who's Jack Matlock. I hope I'm getting his name right. Anyway, Putin asks, why all the weaponry? Why all the missiles right on our border? And the former ambassador turns to Putin and says, Vladimir, you don't understand. It has nothing to do with Russia. It's just a jobs program for back in the States. And Putin says, couldn't you have a different jobs program? And if he'd been able to whip out the studies that the University of Massachusetts Amherst has done that show that military spending actually reduces jobs rather than increasing them, that would have been a nice debate point. But no, the notion in U.S. academia that the major threat to global stability and the rule of law and peace on earth is the seizure and occupation of Crimea, which everybody, even Amy Goodman repeats this, everybody just rehashes. I mean, when people voted over 90% to rejoin Russia in Crimea, and not a single opponent of that vote has ever dared to suggest they hold another vote, because everybody knows they would vote the same way again, what would be a preferable way of people self-determining their fate? What way do you propose to me that's more peaceful, that's better than that? Now, I make no apologies for Russian militarism. I want to close the Russian base in Crimea just like I want to close every U.S. base everywhere. But the notion that getting rid of NATO, this incredible force of instability, I mean, if NATO is about protecting the North Atlantic, what is Colombia doing in it, other than threatening Venezuela? If NATO is protecting Northern Europe, you know, what is it doing, attacking Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq? You know, no. Short answer should have been no. Do you believe the U.S. military should be abolished as well as the National Guard? Abolishing war equals abolishing army. Yes. Along with every other military. This past December 1st was 70 years since Costa Rica put its military exactly where every military should go, and that was in a museum. If you could abolish war and keep militaries as things that just sort of sit around and used to be used for wars, that wouldn't bother me much, you know. But given that the more you spend on preparing for wars, the more wars you get, I don't see that solution working out so well. What mantra maybe could you suggest be the rallying message for 2020 and any other gathering? 2020 is, am I right to think that means an election? I don't know what 2020 means. I guess put your energy into non-electoral activism might be my mantra for the election of 2020. But I actually do think that this new group out of the UK that's now in the US and many other countries called Extinction Rebellion is a well-named group. I mean, when this little girl from Sweden gets everybody to walk out of school in Sweden and then speaks at the UN and says, I'm here because I've had enough. Because people tell me I should stay in school and study and become a scientist so that I can solve global warming, when global warming has long since been solved and you people just aren't acting on what we all know needs to be done, and it needs to be done immediately. I interviewed a guy. I have a radio show, talknationradio.org, and lots of radio stations is where to find it. I interviewed a guy who I think I'll send out this show next week from this group, Extinction Rebellion, who was one of these guys who shut off pipelines 2 years ago, risking prison. And he said, I just don't understand it. If there was a hurricane right here, right now, everybody would be dropping everything and working on it. But we all know that worse than a hurricane is coming, and we just sit there. So time's up might be a good motto. Does the movement to save us from ourselves need a name? What is our narrative? How can we inspire? How can we respire and recruit, maybe? I think we have to stress to people both what the looming disadvantages of sitting around are and what the looming advantages of changing our ways are. You know, the United States has almost as much money per capita as anywhere else on earth. It's not the top, but it's very close to it. And you can go to many other wealthy countries on this planet and live a longer life, live a healthier life, live a more prosperous and secure life with a better education, with a more sustainable and creative and joyful society. In fact, the United States is almost at the bottom of every measure of quality of life among all the wealthy countries. And the big difference, other than not taxing billionaires and corporations, is dumping everything into the military. For these little fractions of military spending that you could transform the earth with, you could also transform this country. You can make college free, you can make preschool free, you can make top quality everything from healthcare to education to green energy to transportation free. And by free, I'm not imagining some magical socialist force that you know actually prints money, which is pretty close to what the Green New Deal is actually proposing to do. I'm proposing we go get money that's sitting in a criminal enterprise that's counterproductive and use some of it for something good. And you can have a better world. Linguistic problem, question mark. War on drugs, war on poverty, war on cancer. Yes, totally agree. Very bad, misleading, and destructive use of language that points people in the wrong direction. Why not avoid producing cancer? Why not look at cancer medically as something other than a war enemy? These bases that the United States has around the globe, and this may be one way that we get them closed, are not just, in many, many cases, zones of hostility and resentment and drunkenness and rape and disorderly conduct, but zones of cancer. And so are U.S. bases in this country. And a friend of mine, a colleague in World Beyond War, Pat Elder, has really just started working on this project in a big way, but there's a couple of chemicals. I think their initials are PFAS and PFOS, but they're chemicals used to put out fires, and they practice putting out fires on military bases, and they poison the water. And they are poisoning the groundwater around U.S. military bases across this country and across the globe, and people who work on them and live anywhere near them are having miscarriages and all sorts of dramatic health problems as a result. We don't need a war on cancer. We need to stop the wars that are creating cancer. You mentioned things we can do instead with the money we spend. Yeah, these questions have such good timing. They are always about what I just said. You mentioned things we can do instead with the money we spend on preparing for and going to wars. Please describe how you see doing these things would help keep us safer. Well, the nation that does the most to keep itself safe is seen in Gallup and Pew polls around the world as the greatest threat to peace, most resented by the most populations around the globe. If Canada wanted to generate anti-Canadian terrorist networks on a U.S. scale, it would have to do a lot of bombing, a lot of occupying, a lot of kicking indoors, a lot of threats, a lot of punishment for upholding the rule of law and supporting the International Criminal Court. It would have to turn itself into a hated, resented, rogue nation, and it could then generate anti-Canadian terrorism on a U.S. scale and justify buying even more Canadian weapons in order to combat the anti-Canadian terrorism. But it's a vicious cycle. It's counterproductive, right? I mean, 95% of terrorism is against occupations, against wars. I have not found a single terrorist incident generated by resentment over the provision of food and water and medicine and books to a country. It hasn't happened, right? Because it's not counterproductive. It doesn't make people hate you.
Two more questions.
Okay, which are the best two?
This one.
Okay, I'm doing the best two questions, so the other questions, I'm sorry, they were not good questions. I can answer them in the hallway. Los Alamos National Laboratory, how can we get a discussion on their mission and cost? Isn't the continued production of plutonium pits at Los Alamos National Laboratory against the treaty the U.S. signed with Russia? I think you all probably know a lot more about this than I do, and who's doing the research and who could do more research. But I think it is worth trying a variety of angles among the local public, including health angles, including international law violation angles, including financial cost angles, and seeing what gets people energized, and seeing what you can take to local governments and get resolutions passed on, or at least major debates on, and I'll be glad to work with any of you on that further. World Beyond War has helped a lot of local governments pass a lot of resolutions. How can we address the underlying fear people have in response to no more military? Even I think, well, we can keep the National Guard. Well, the National Guard used to belong to states, and if a state wants to keep its state militia, it can tell the federal government that it's doing just that, and it's not going to send it off to make the U.S. hated by killing people far away. It's going to stick around for the hurricanes and disasters that are in all the television ads for the National Guard. How can we deal with people's fear? I think through education, through facts, and through their understanding that drastic change isn't the only way to go about this, that we could start with some first steps. If we were to thank U.S. troops for watching sporting events in only 174 countries, would you feel less safe? Would you be able to tell me which was the country they had left? So I think there's a lot of education that has to be done. It has to be personal and vary with the particular person, because people all have different fears. But I think getting people to recognize that nuclear apocalypse and climate change are actually far, far more frightening than a Muslim with a knife who is not actually a threat to you. That in fact, many, many more people die from bad diets and unsafe workplaces and stares than die from foreign Muslim terrorists coming to the United States. So it's okay to be afraid. Just, start being rationally afraid of the threats in proper order. I've seen a lot of people change their minds. So the notion that it's not possible is just plain false. Thanks for the great questions.
So we're not quite done yet. We still have something super to look at. And I want to thank you all for coming tonight. And as you do drive home, I want you to drive safely. If you want to talk with David, he's going to be out in the lobby selling and autographing his books. If you want to receive emails from his two groups, rootsaction.org and World Beyond War, there are sign-up sheets in the tables in the lobby. Again, donations are making this program possible, and there are donation jars as you leave the sanctuary, and we would appreciate your support. And again, we said it at the outset, but I really want to give a great big thank you to Sally Alice Thompson. This event was her inspiration, and she enabled it to happen. Now, we've got a real treat for you. The Raging Grannies are going to give, they're going to end the program with one of their very thoughtful and provocative songs, and we'll see you in the lobby after they finish. So I am delighted to present the Raging Grannies.
The words are on the back of your program.
We're not on?
Are we on?
Oh, there goes one. The words are on the back of your program. Would you like to join us? On the first day of Christmas, we gave our little ones a six-shooter, holster, and gun. On the second day of Christmas, we gave our little ones 2 G.I. Joes and a six-shooter, holster, and gun. On the third day of Christmas, we gave our little gave our little ones. Glorified war, violence and gore and horror. Look what we have done. We are teaching them war from day one. Now we're shocked that our country is full of violence, gun-happy killers. What's wrong with them? Maybe we should look at what we're teaching little ones and stop teaching them killings and guns. We should rather be teaching them tolerance and love. Let's give our children games of joy and laughter, friendship and kindness, gentle compassion, artistic beauty, love for the planet. Let's teach them peace, joy to all the world, goodwill and healing harmony. Give our children the gift of world peace.
To remind you all that David Swanson has books for sale out in the lobby, so stop by if you want to get some books, and he's happy to sign them for you.